Welcome to Pages from History, where the turning points of civilization unfold before your eyes. Today we journey to 1588, when the greatest armada ever assembled sailed to conquer England, only to meet a fate written by the heavens themselves. Stay with us until the end to discover how a storm changed history forever. First, the empire's ambition, Philip's grand design. The year was 1587. And King Philip II of Spain sat in his palace chamber at El Escorial, surrounded by maps of northern Europe. Candlelight flickered across his weathered face as he studied the coastline of England with the intensity of a predator observing prey. His black velvet doublet, adorned with golden thread, seemed to absorb the shadows that danced across the stone walls. Philip's empire stretched across 4 continents, from the silver mines of Peru to the spice islands of the Philippines. Spanish galleons returned monthly with treasures that filled his coffers and funded the mightiest army Christianity had ever known. Yet one small island kingdom defied him, mocked his faith, and sheltered the pirates who plundered his treasure fleets. England under Queen Elizabeth had embraced Protestant heresy, executing Catholic priests and confiscating church lands throughout the realm. Elizabeth's sea captains sanctioned pirates like Francis Drake, raided Spanish colonies with impunity, and returned home as heroes. Philip's advisors whispered that divine providence demanded he restore the true faith to England by force of arms. The Spanish king's fingers traced the English Channel on his map, calculating distances and imagining his soldiers marching through London. His plan was audacious: assemble an invincible fleet to transport the Duke of Parma's veteran army from the Netherlands to English shores. Once landed, these battle-hardened tercios would sweep aside England's amateur militias like chaff before the wind. In the shipyards of Lisbon, Cadiz, and Seville, carpenters worked day and night constructing vessels for the great enterprise. Massive galleons rose from the docks, their oak timbers thick enough to withstand cannon fire, their decks designed to carry soldiers. The smell of tar, sawdust, and sea salt filled the air as Spain prepared for holy war. Philip appointed the Duke of Medina Sidonia to command the fleet, despite the Duke's protests that he lacked naval experience. Medina Sidonia was a capable administrator and devout Catholic, qualities Philip valued more than seafaring knowledge in this crusade. The Duke accepted his fate with resignation, knowing that refusal would dishonor his family and displease his sovereign. Throughout Spain, priests blessed the enterprise from their pulpits, calling it a divine mission to rescue English souls from damnation. Young nobles eager for glory volunteered by the hundreds, seeing the invasion as their pathway to fame and eternal salvation. Peasants contributed their meager savings, believing they purchased their place in heaven by funding God's righteous war. By spring of 1588, the Armada numbered 130 ships, carrying 30,000 men and 2,400 cannons. Supplies filled the holds: salt pork, hardtack, wine, gunpowder, cannonballs, and sacramental wine for daily mass at sea. The fleet represented the pinnacle of Spanish power, a floating fortress that would make Elizabeth kneel before Catholic supremacy. Philip knelt in his private chapel, his arthritic knees protesting against the cold stone floor as he prayed for victory. He envisioned English cathedrals restored to Catholic worship, heretic nobles executed, and Elizabeth imprisoned in the Tower of London. With trembling hands, he blessed himself and whispered that God's will would be done through Spanish swords and cannons. Second, England's Defiance Drake and the Sea Dogs. In Plymouth Harbor, Francis Drake stood on the deck of his flagship Revenge, watching his crew prepare for the coming onslaught. The legendary sea captain wore a simple leather jerkin despite his knighthood, preferring practicality to the elaborate ruffs favored at court. His weathered face and calculating eyes spoke of decades spent on dangerous waters, outwitting enemies who commanded superior forces. Drake had circumnavigated the globe, plundered Spanish treasure ports, and returned with holds full of stolen gold and silver. The Spanish called him El Drac, the dragon, and offered a fortune for his head on a pike in Madrid's central plaza. Elizabeth called him her pirate, her secret weapon, a man who understood that Spain's wealth was also its greatest vulnerability. England's navy was smaller and lighter than Spain's, built for speed and maneuverability rather than carrying soldiers in floating fortresses. Drake's ships could sail circles around Spanish galleons, firing their cannons at range before the enemy could close for boarding. The English sailors were veterans of countless raids, men who knew that survival depended on cunning rather than brute force. Queen Elizabeth herself visited the coastal defenses, her red hair glowing beneath a pearl-studded circlet as she inspected the troops. She wore a breastplate over her white gown, symbolizing her willingness to stand with her people against the Catholic invasion. Her speech to the assembled soldiers rang with defiance, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king of England. In London's narrow streets, blacksmiths forged pikes and swords, while merchants organized food supplies for the anticipated siege. Church bells rang daily, calling citizens to prayer for divine protection against the overwhelming force sailing toward their shores. Rumors spread through the taverns. The Spanish would burn heretics alive, enslave Protestant families, and install Philip as England's king. Drake's intelligence network brought news that the Armada finally departed Lisbon despite unfavorable weather and supply shortages. The Sea Dogs, as Drake's captains were known, held council in Plymouth, studying maps and plotting their defensive strategy. They would harass the Spanish fleet continuously, never allowing it to rest or regroup as it sailed up the English Channel. English beacons stood ready along the coast, massive bonfires prepared to spread the alarm when Spanish sails appeared on the horizon. Fishermen and coastal villagers were recruited as watchers, their keen eyes scanning the southern seas for the enemy armada. Every able-bodied man drilled with pike and musket, knowing that if the Spanish landed, England's fate would be decided by common soldiers. Lord Howard of Effingham commanded England's naval forces, his aristocratic bearing belying his respect for Drake's tactical genius. Howard wisely gave Drake freedom to engage the enemy as he saw fit, recognizing superior seamanship when he witnessed it. Together they represented England's dual strengths, noble leadership and common-born expertise forged in the crucible of Atlantic storms. As July dawned, Drake allegedly played bowls on Plymouth Hoe when the lookout cried that Spanish sails darkened the southern horizon. According to legend, Drake calmly finished his game, declaring there was time enough to defeat Spain after completing the match. Whether truth or myth, the story captured Drake's confidence that England's smaller fleet possessed advantages Spain's admirals could never comprehend. Third, the invincible Armada set sail. The Armada's departure from Lisbon had been delayed by storms, spoiled provisions, and a daring raid by Drake on Cadiz. When the fleet finally assembled, many ships already showed signs of wear, their crews suffering from disease and poor food. Yet Medina Sidonia ordered the banners raised, the anchors lifted, and the greatest naval expedition in history began its fateful journey. The sight was magnificent and terrifying. 130 ships spread across miles of ocean, their sails forming a white forest. Massive galleons led the formation, their high castles bristling with cannons and soldiers eager for battle and plunder. Smaller vessels darted between the giants, carrying messages, supplies, and reinforcements wherever the admirals commanded them needed. Aboard the flagship San Martin, Medina Sidonia maintained strict religious discipline, requiring Mass 3 times daily for officers and crew. Priests moved among the soldiers, hearing confessions and granting absolution to men who believed they sailed on God's righteous mission. The Duke himself spent hours in prayer, seeking divine guidance for a task he believed exceeded his modest capabilities. The Armada sailed north along Portugal's coast before turning east toward the English Channel, maintaining tight formation despite contrary winds. Spanish officers enforced brutal discipline, flogging sailors who failed their duties and hanging deserters from the yardarms as warnings. The fleet moved slowly, constrained by its slowest vessels and the need to protect vulnerable supply ships from English raiders. Below decks, soldiers lived in cramped, fetid conditions, their armor rusting in the salt air as they awaited the invasion order. Rats scurried through the holds, consuming precious food stores and spreading disease among men already weakened by seasickness and malnutrition. Veterans of Spanish campaigns in the Netherlands told younger soldiers stories of Protestant savagery to steel their courage for battle. When storms struck, the Armada's discipline proved both blessing and curse, maintaining formation but preventing ships from seeking safer waters. Sailors lashed themselves to masts and rigging, praying to the Virgin Mary as waves crashed over the decks. Several vessels separated from the fleet, damaged by wind and sea, limping toward friendly ports or drifting helplessly toward hostile shores. As the Armada approached the English Channel, lookouts reported English ships shadowing them, always staying just beyond cannon range. Medina Sidonia ordered his captains to ignore the harassers and maintain course toward the rendezvous with Parma's army. The Spanish admirals believed their mission was transportation, not naval combat, a fatal misunderstanding of their strategic situation. English beacons blazed along the coast, chain lighting from Cornwall to Kent, alerting the realm that invasion had arrived. Church bells pealed in towns and villages, calling men to arms while women and children prepared to flee inland. The nation held its breath, knowing that within days, perhaps hours, the fate of England would be decided in blood and fire. The gap between the two fleets narrowed as Drake's ships maneuvered to windward, claiming the weather gauge that gave tactical advantage. Spanish officers watched nervously as English vessels demonstrated superior sailing ability, tacking and turning with precision their own ships couldn't match. The sea itself seemed to favor England, providing winds that aided the defenders while frustrating the invaders' progress. Fourth, battle in the Channel, fire and fury. The first engagement erupted off Plymouth as Drake's ships swooped down on the Armada's rear guard like hawks attacking a flock. English cannons roared, their lighter shot flying faster and farther than Spanish guns designed for close-range boarding actions. Spanish ships returned fire, but the English vessels danced away, reloaded, and struck again before the Armada could respond effectively. Day after day, the running battle continued up the English Channel, Spanish ships maintaining formation while English captains harassed relentlessly. The sound of cannon fire became constant, a rolling thunder that echoed off the white cliffs of Dover and terrified coastal villagers. Smoke from burning gunpowder obscured the sun, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere that seemed to confirm this was indeed a holy war. Spanish soldiers crowded the rails, desperate to board and fight hand-to-hand where their superior numbers would prove decisive. But English captains refused to close, understanding that their advantage lay in gunnery and seamanship, not steel-on-steel combat. Frustration mounted among Spanish officers as they realized their enemy would not fight according to established rules of naval warfare. The Armada anchored off Calais, awaiting word from the Duke of Parma that his army was ready to embark for England. Medina Sidonia sent urgent messages demanding immediate action, but Parma's soldiers remained blocked in port by Dutch rebel ships. The fleet sat exposed and vulnerable, its crews exhausted from constant combat, and its commanders paralyzed by strategic confusion. Drake recognized his opportunity and prepared the ultimate terror weapon: fire ships, vessels packed with gunpowder and combustible materials. On a moonless night, 8 blazing ships drifted toward the anchored Armada, carried by tide and wind directly into the Spanish formation. Spanish lookouts screamed warnings as the floating infernos approached, flames leaping from masts and decks like demons from hell. Panic seized the Armada as captains cut their anchor cables and fled into darkness, abandoning formation to escape the fire. Ships collided in the confusion, spars snapping and sails tearing as the disciplined fleet dissolved into chaos. When dawn broke, the Armada was scattered across miles of sea, its strategic advantage lost and its psychological superiority shattered. The Battle of Gravelines followed, the most intense fighting of the campaign, as English ships attacked the disorganized Spanish vessels. Spanish gunners fought bravely, but their heavier cannons fired too slowly, while English ships maintained a murderous rate of fire. Hulls splintered, masts toppled, and blood ran across decks as Spanish casualties mounted, while English ships remained relatively unscathed. Medina Sidonia attempted to rally his fleet, raising signal flags and firing cannons to call his scattered ships back to formation. Some captains responded, but many vessels were too damaged to maneuver effectively, listing badly and struggling to stay afloat. The Duke realized his mission had failed catastrophically, but retreat was impossible, with English ships blocking the Channel route home. As ammunition ran low on both sides, the wind shifted yet again, pushing the Armada northeast toward the treacherous shoals. Spanish pilots frantically consulted their charts, knowing that ships this size would be torn apart if driven into shallow waters. England held its collective breath, watching nature itself seem to intervene on behalf of the Protestant cause. Fifth, the Protestant wind, nature's judgment. With retreat through the Channel impossible, Medina Sidonia made the desperate decision to sail north around Scotland and Ireland. The route was dangerous, filled with rocky coasts and violent storms that had destroyed previous expeditions in those northern waters. Spanish sailors, already exhausted and demoralized, faced a journey of 2,000 miles through hostile seas without adequate supplies. The weather that had favored England in the Channel now became England's executioner, delivering judgment the English navy had begun. Storms of unprecedented violence struck the fleeing Armada, waves like mountains smashing ships against each other and splintering oak. Sailors who had survived, English cannons now drowned in icy waters or froze to death, clinging to wreckage under rain-lashed skies. Irish coast dwellers watched Spanish ships founder on rocks, breaking apart as crews screamed prayers to saints who seemed deaf. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers managed to reach shore, only to be killed by English garrison troops or Irish clans claiming bounties. Those who surrendered were stripped of their possessions and armor, left to die of exposure or executed as invaders. The San Martin survived the voyage, carrying Medina Sidonia back to Spain, a broken man, his hair turned white from stress. Of the 130 ships that had departed Lisbon with such confidence, fewer than 70 limped home to Spanish ports. More than 15,000 men perished, not from English guns, but from storms that Protestants called divine intervention and Catholics called tragedy. In England, Queen Elizabeth ordered days of thanksgiving, proclaiming that God had blown his winds and scattered her enemies. The phrase, "he blew with his winds," was struck on commemorative medals, cementing the storm's role in England's miraculous deliverance. Drake and the other sea dogs became national heroes, though they knew the weather had achieved what their cannons alone could not. Philip II received the catastrophic news in the privacy of his chapel, falling to his knees in prayer and acceptance. He refused to blame Medina Sidonia publicly, recognizing that forces beyond any admiral's control had destroyed his grand enterprise. Yet privately he wept, understanding that Spanish dominance of the seas had ended and a new maritime power was rising. The Spanish Empire would continue for another century, but never again would it attempt such an ambitious invasion of England. The failed Armada shifted European balance of power, emboldening Protestant nations and demonstrating that Spain was not invincible after all. England's naval supremacy would grow from this foundation, eventually creating the British Empire that would dominate 3 centuries. Survivors of the Armada rarely spoke of their experiences, haunted by memories of drowning comrades and ships consumed by merciless seas. In Spanish ports, mothers searched arriving ships for sons who would never return, their bodies resting in unmarked ocean graves. The catastrophe entered Spanish memory as a national trauma, a reminder that even the mightiest empires cannot command the heavens. Historians would debate for centuries whether superior English tactics, Spanish strategic errors, or divine providence determined the outcome. What remained indisputable was that a storm at the perfect moment had prevented Catholic reconquest of Protestant England forever. The Protestant wind became legend, a story of how nature itself seemed to choose sides in humanity's religious and political conflicts. The Spanish Armada's destruction marked a turning point in Western civilization, preserving Protestant England and enabling the rise of British global power. The storm that scattered Philip's fleet became legend, a reminder that human ambition, however grand, remains subject to forces beyond our control. Thank you for joining Pages from History on this epic journey. Like, comment, and subscribe to explore more defining moments that shaped our world.